Hi everybody, hi students, professors, friends of LSB. We're here with a great man. Can I call it a great man?
Yeah, I hope.
This we will not edit out. We're here with a great man, a man that goes by the name of John Lusk. John was here last week at LSB, weren't you?
I was, enjoyed it.
Yeah, in my entrepreneurship class. You would wonder why John came to the entrepreneurship class at LSB. Well, because John is not just a great man, he's also an author of a best-selling book that we have here with us, Mouse Driver Chronicles, and a seasoned entrepreneur. Welcome to LSB, John. I have today a couple of things I want to do with you. So I want to discuss a little bit your journey. I want to touch upon the book as well, Mouse Driver Chronicles, which, to be completely frank, I feel very guilty. I only found out about it a couple of weeks ago when you told me. I wasn't aware of the book. I'm usually a huge fan of entrepreneurship books.
I should be a better self-promoter of my background.
You definitely should. You're a bit too modest there. The book was written and published in early 2000s, right?
That's correct. It came out in January of 2002. My business partner at the time, Kyle Harrison, and I wrote the book for the most part through most of 2001, but it was based on newsletters and a diary that we kept from 1999 through 2022.
Excellent. So before we get into the book itself, let's start a little bit by just the classic age-old question. How come you ended up in Luxembourg?
It's a great question. It's probably not the straightforward answer that everybody thinks.
Never is.
When I met my wife back in 2009 and we were talking about getting married, she made me promise her that at some point in time we would have a European experience. And by European experience, maybe go live in Europe for 1 or 2 years so that we could just have that different opportunity. And in 2017, I was an operating partner for a private equity firm as well as an entrepreneur in residence with the Kauffman Foundation. And I felt like I was in the process of kind of sunsetting my career and kind of going into consulting and advising, and she pulled me off to the side and she said, "Hey, you're doing really well now, you seem really happy. Doesn't this seem like a good opportunity to go have our European experience?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that." And so, the best way of getting to Europe, you obviously, I think most people know, you got to have a visa to go live in a different country. You can't just move to another country. And so I started looking at the UK and Europe to understand what were the job opportunities for me. And after about, I'd say, 9 to 12 months, I landed on Spire. And Spire was based in Glasgow at the time, but they had just raised money from the Luxembourg Innovation Fund here, and they were relocating their headquarters because of Brexit to Luxembourg, and they gave me the opportunity of Glasgow or Luxembourg, and we chose Luxembourg, having never visited here. And so that was in 2018. I started commuting to Luxembourg from Seattle in July of 2018, and then we moved here in November of 2018.
Excellent. So for those of you that don't know, many people do know in Luxembourg, but maybe outside of Luxembourg you don't. Tell us about Spire.
Spire is a space-to-data analytics company. At the highest level, they build, design, manufacture low Earth orbit satellites. These are satellites that are about the size of a bottle of wine. And then they launch those satellites into space. They use launch providers like SpaceX. And those satellites circumvent the Earth. They're in Earth's atmosphere at low Earth orbit, and they're going around the Earth multiple times a day, and they're collecting information from Earth. So in a sense, they're listening to the Earth, and they're collecting radio frequency data. So their satellites track assets such as ships, aircraft, and they also collect weather data. So that's the core of what Spire does. They take that data, they then sell that data to companies that are building analytics, building solutions. Spire also builds their own solutions and sells that data as well. And then they have a fourth business, which we call Space as a Service, which is taking on the opportunities where other companies realize that there's an advantage to collecting data from space, and they'll go to Spire and say, "Hey, can you build a constellation for me and manage that constellation for us so that we can have this unique data?"
So that's what I understand Spire is today. What was Spire back when you joined? So you mentioned maritime, you mentioned airplanes. Was that already as a service back when you joined?
Yeah, I mean the vision of Spire, so the space as a service business was really a secondary idea. So that was a business that we kind of learned over time that, hey, we have this core capability, we have this skill set, can we monetize that? It's very similar to AWS. You know, they built AWS, Amazon did internally, and then they realized, hey, others might be able to use this. From its outset, the vision of Spire was to utilize low Earth orbit satellites to have a pretty big impact on the global economy. And they wanted to maximize those satellites by putting as much or as many payloads on those small satellites as possible that would allow them to collect various data sets. So the idea was always that they would collect aviation, maritime, and weather data. They weren't exactly sure from the outset how they were going to monetize that or how they were going to build the infrastructure to essentially begin to commercialize that. But that was the general problem they wanted to solve in space, was can you have 3 different payloads on this very small satellite, essentially being the beginning of 3 very different businesses.
So how does that look like? Your wife tells you, hey, do you remember that European promise? And from that moment to starting to work for Spire, so how did you go about that?
I would say really just using the network. So, you know, I've lived all my life in the U.S. I've worked all my life in the U.S. I went to business school at the University of Pennsylvania at Wharton. My wife spent a couple years, you know, working at Harvard Business School. And so both of us had a network of folks that worked and were from, you know, Europe or the UK. So what I started to do was just really contact individuals that I knew working in the UK, because I don't speak another language, and that was English, and really letting people know that I was looking for opportunities. And I spent about, I'd say, 6 months just calling people, talking to people, getting introduced to recruiters, getting introduced to investors, various companies. And I would get up at 3 or 4 in the morning Seattle time because of the time difference in Europe, and I would have phone calls. And then I made an effort to actually come to Europe, to go to London, to go to Edinburgh, to go to Luxembourg, to actually meet people, because if you don't show up in person, they don't really believe it when you say, hey, I want to move to Europe, right? They want to know that you're actually committed. So I really just focused on the networking. I knew that I had a couple of skill sets that I could probably lean into. One was being an entrepreneur and having been involved in startups and knowing that Europe, you know, needed founders, needed entrepreneurs, needed experienced people who could scale companies. But I also had experience on the private equity side. Now I'm working with private equity firms as an operating partner. So I leaned into those 2 areas and networked into companies and investors that would maybe look at my background and say that's something that we might need and utilize.
And what in your previous experience has made you think you should feel comfortable going into space, so to say? Have you had any prior experience?
No, I mean, I had no experience in the space industry. I had no real experience in the data industry, although I had worked at a company called White Pages in the past, which was a company that collected personal data from individuals. But I really didn't have any experience on either of those. The experience I did have was knowing how to look at a business, analyze a business, and understand from the bottoms up, what do you need to sort of solve, what do you need to address to get to a business to the point where you have product market fit and the ability to scale. So I had that confidence of, regardless of the industry I went into, I had the confidence that I knew how to approach it, but I also knew that I had this thirst for learning. And so if it was a new industry, I knew I wanted to jump in and learn a new industry. And if you look at my career, it doesn't do this. I jump industries back and forth, because I like to learn new things and I feel like I can have an impact in certain areas.
Excellent. So, okay, this is great because we have now sort of touched upon multiple topics that I want to unpack. So let's get ready for that.
Perfect.
We will have an entire discussion about space because that's obviously something that everybody is interested in these days. It's also something that's a big topic in Luxembourg, which for many foreigners, it's always a surprise when they found out. But before that, I want to touch exactly on what you just said. You had the ability, you had confidence that you can enter any industry and that you have the ability to, let's call it, to figure it out quite quickly. Indeed, that's what we at business schools like to think, that we teach that that we give students the capabilities and the competency to really understand industry dynamics, basically irrespective of what the industry actually is. To be precise, at Wharton you did your MBA, or what did you do at Wharton?
I did my MBA at Wharton.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wharton's a great school, obviously. It's a lot of the graduates go into finance industry or equity consulting, etc. So Wharton's super famous for that. I want to, without talking about business education as such, but I wanted to ask two things. So in your book, Mouse Driver Chronicles, we see, I would say, the real entrepreneurial story. And if you talk about this book in isolation, you might easily say, you don't need a business school, because the real life is just very dirty and, very, it's about surviving. It's not about making big strategic plans. That being said, my experience was always that it's always easy to say such a comment for people that have actually had business school education. Yeah. They're the first one to always say, you don't need a business school. On the other hand, when you talk to people that don't have business education, they really very often just don't see certain things that people who did their MBA see. They don't understand whether it's the financial aspects or let's say how everything fits together. So I'm going to ask you today that only once. What is your perspective, Wharton MBA, having done what you've done, having been in, so to speak, in the entrepreneurial mud, as well as having been in private equity in listed companies? How would you, looking back, value your Wharton experience?
Oh, I'd put a tremendous amount of value on my Wharton experience. For me, it was about confidence. It was about having the confidence to cross over that line and actually become an entrepreneur. And I knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur before I went to Wharton. And in fact, I chose Wharton because of their entrepreneurship program. So for me, it was about confidence building. I didn't feel like I had all the knowledge and understanding, despite the fact that I majored in business in my undergraduate program and had worked in consulting. I just felt like I didn't have that confidence. Secondly, just the network that you build in business school, the people that you meet, the number of individuals that have just such diverse backgrounds really opened my eyes to the fact that there was just a lot of different businesses out there, a lot of different ways to tune your mind into doing things. And so I found it incredibly valuable. Now back to your entrepreneurship, sort of comment, I don't think you need a business degree to start a company. I think what you really truly need, take away all the basic stuff of there's a problem to be solved and stuff like that. You've got to have grit, determination, resilience, and a vision. You have that, it doesn't matter where you go to business school, if you go to school. You have to have those four things in my mind to truly succeed as an entrepreneur. If you have those innards in you, you will learn one way or the other, because entrepreneurship is very hard.
This is great, because I couldn't agree more with you. I think, there's never a one solution to everything, right? So in that sense, definitely education, whether it's business education or education in general, is not going to solve all of your problems. But probably the most important thing these days is really the ability how to learn and then just build those quick feedback loops and improve, right? And then that connected with resilience and grit and everything, I think I totally see it. I actually have a funny definition of what entrepreneurship is that I always say to my students on day one.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, okay. I will give an unfiltered version and later we can edit it. If you have the ability to wake up in the morning feeling like you're king of the universe and the world is your oyster, as they would say, and that's how you start your day, by 11 a.m. your world is falling apart, everything is going to shit. Then if you have enough physical ability to get an appetite for lunch, go through that lunch, think about something else. After lunch, by the time you digest, things have improved By 5 p.m., 11 a.m. seemed like nothing. 5 p.m. you're looking for to do very bad things. Like you're really considering stopping, you're considering giving up. And basically, if you can then go to sleep and wake up the next day, again with that feeling, I literally think that's 80% of the whole story.
That's pretty accurate. I mean, entrepreneurship is, all it is just a series of peaks and valleys. And the ability to pick yourself up when you're in those valleys and to keep going, I think is absolutely critical. In our first venture, which we had lots of those peaks and valleys, it was super helpful that I was doing it with somebody else.
And by first venture, you mean the
Mouse Driver, yeah. So Kyle Harrison and I were roommates in business school, and Kyle actually came up with this idea.
Let's jump into it.
So when we started that company, we kind of assumed that because we had gone to Wharton that this thing would just magically be successful and we wouldn't have to do a whole lot. And I think we realized very, very early on that it didn't really matter where we went to school or if we went to school. It was really about, do you have something that solves a problem and do people want to buy it? But we had a lot of those troughs, a lot of challenges. And if we didn't have each other, it would have been very, very difficult. A lot of times if Kyle was feeling low, I was feeling high, and so I would bring him up, and vice versa. When I was feeling low, he was feeling. And I'm not real sure that we evaluated each other when we were roommates as to whether or not we would be good business partners. I think we were a bit naive, but I think our personalities and our different skill sets. He was an engineering mind. I was more of a strategic thinker, marketer. I was more of an optimist. He was more of a realist. And that combination, I think, really, really helped us. But it was not easy, and it felt like somebody just kind of whacked us across the head with a stick, because we really thought that it would be, I think, much easier than it actually was.
Listening to you now, I think I got a unique insight into something I just realized. When people talk about what we previously discussed about whether a business school helped your education or not, and then you said to start a company you don't really need to it's not about education, it's about grit, etc. It made me realize very often people frame the question in a wrong way, because arguably whether you went to a business school or not has little to do whether you're able to start a company. It might help you down the road how to manage that company, but what you just said shows that actually entrepreneurship is the great equalizer. And what I mean by that, and again, it's just popped up in my head now, because imagine how unfair life would be if actually going to Wharton pretty much resolves the idea that you're going to start a successful business. We would be a feudal society, literally, right? Because you just go to Wharton or LSB or whatever, and your chances of starting a good company would be 99% higher than anyone else. But that's the beauty. It's not the case. You will finish Wharton, you will go out into the market, and the guy with no shoes still can compete with you and kick your ass. Actually, it just popped up in my mind. What a great insight that is.
No, I mean it's absolutely true. Yeah. I think where the education that I got at Wharton was incredibly helpful, and where I wish I actually would have paid more attention are in some of those classes where once you've reached a scale level in your business and you have a sizable organization, that's where a lot of that knowledge and insight started coming back to me. I can remember taking an organizational behavior class at Wharton, and I liked the class, but I was thinking, well, when am I ever going to use this, right? And I remember, probably 4 or 5 years ago, when I was running Spire Maritime, thinking, I was trying to figure out where did I put all my notes from the organizational behavior class, because I felt like most of my job at that point in time was around organizational behavior. So it is a great equalizer. I think anybody can start a company. Anybody can start a company. I think depending on where you live, it's easier to do so. But education should not be the barrier or the bottleneck to anybody having the motivation to start something.
And this is also great. It connects into something I wanted to discuss. It's one thing to start a company, as you said, anyone can start a company, anyone can succeed at it and fail at it. Doesn't matter who you are, where you went. But talk to us about that point where you start scaling. For many entrepreneurs, and I'm talking about like real entrepreneurs with grit and everything you discussed, going from 0 to, let's say, 50 employees is one thing. Going from 50 to 200 is a completely different approach. And then going from 200 to building a corporation is yet something else. So that's generally accepted opinion, that these are just different skill sets. I've felt it on my own skin very much so, because I felt very comfortable in that first phase. And then I realized at one point I need help, right? Because just by personality type, I never saw myself as someone who would ever like to run a huge organization, to be honest. So tell us about, your experience, and let's still keep it general before we go into details, but what type of skills one requires to go from 0 to 50 people, so to speak? It's not even about people, but this earliest stage, and then what does it take to scale?
It's a great question. I think, early stage, you have to expect that what you're doing, as well as the people that you might be hiring in those early stages, you're really doing everything. I used to call it jack of all trades, right? Or we would call it a T-shaped individuals. T-shaped meaning that, you might have a specific expertise, might be engineering, might be product management, might be marketing, but you're actually doing all kinds of things. You might be selling, you might be taking the trash out, you might be doing a bit of coding. And early on, you want to get people that are T-shaped, because you don't know where you're going to be focusing. Your sole objective when you're early stage is to prove that you have some level of product market fit. And again, that's a relatively generic term, but you want to prove that you have something that somebody will buy. And ideally that somebody is more than one person. And you get to that point where you have that product market fit. And until you get to a certain level of scale, and for different companies I think it varies, but you kind of know. And when you get to a certain level of scale, you realize that all of a sudden you need to hire someone who's solely focused on marketing. Or you need to hire somebody that's solely focused on reviewing contracts. And all of a sudden, the T-shaped skills become strictly vertically shaped. And you start to hire people that can only focus on one thing. And that becomes a challenge, because the folks that are attracted to startups, a lot of the individuals that are attracted to startups like the idea that they kind of come in there and they can do a bunch of different things. Yeah. There's energy in that. It's fun. It's quite frankly harder to hold people accountable when you're asking them to do a bunch of different things versus asking them to do one thing. True. And when you start asking people who love to be spread out doing a bunch of different things, which you need in the early stages to do one thing, they don't like it. Because one, they're being asked to do one thing, that might be kind of boring. And two, you're going to start holding them much more accountable, right? You're going to be assigning them true KPIs. And so the biggest transition that I've found, of course you have your technology stack, you have your ability to scale from a platform perspective, you have your processes, your procedures, all these different things need to adjust over time as you get bigger. But for me, the biggest challenge was like, how do you evolve the organization? How do you modify the structure? How do you identify the right people? How do you go through that pain of replacing people that have been with you for a period of time as you scale? Because every level of scale, one, your organizational structure changes, the type of people that you need change. You start to rely on people from the outside more than on the inside to hire, because you need to go find very specific expertise, and you may not have that internally. And so for me, it really was more of the organizational challenge as we scaled more than anything else. And of course, you've got like, how do we continue to get the same growth rates? How do we become profitable? But everything to me was tied to the people, right? For me, people are the biggest challenge. That is the hardest thing to solve for, because you can't just apply, although everybody's saying you can't just apply AI to someone's mind and mentality and their emotions. And how you address that within an organization, to me, is the advantage. That is the differentiator that I think most great companies have, is they figured out how to nurture this culture and how to go through all those changes not with ease, but with an understanding of how this might impact the entire company.
Yeah, I think that's the key. The key word you just said is culture, right? So because at one point, when you start dealing with a lot of people, the only way you can do it is not by micromanaging individuals, but by setting a framework or a culture. Right?
That's exactly right.
I remember very vividly, by nature, I'm a little bit skeptical always of things. And I remember, years ago when I first saw Amazon's leadership principles, I thought, like, what? It's such an American thing, a lot of blah. And then when you really think about it, when I actually read them and thought about them, it became evident, okay, how do you manage an organization of 500,000 people at the time? The only way you can do it is the way people have figured out thousands of years ago. You basically create 10 commandments, right? Or whatever the equivalent is. There is no other way. Anything else drives into layers and layers of mid-management and just a labyrinth and bureaucracy. So culture. So how was it for you being an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur in your early days and then jumping into private equity, jumping with the sharks? How was that? How was the private equity experience?
I really enjoyed it, right? Because as an operating partner, I wasn't really on the financial engineering side. I wasn't the one looking at, like, okay, how do we take this company, financially engineer it in such a way that we feel confident that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years that we're going to get a return on this, either with some sort of exit or selling to another sponsor. For me, I really enjoyed the fact that I could go into existing companies, build a relationship with the CEOs or the founders. Most of them were founder CEOs, and I could build this relationship because of my background, because I had been an entrepreneur before.
You've been in their shoes.
I'd been in their shoes, and so I could build that relationship relatively quickly. And I enjoyed it because I could go in there and, again, take the experiences that I had had up to that point and not necessarily say, hey, you need to go do this, but come in with different ideas and insights that the private equity folks probably could not provide, right? They could maybe provide it because they'd seen it from a pattern recognition perspective in other companies, but they hadn't necessarily been in the trenches. So I really enjoyed that. It was kind of challenging in some cases because I could see, I know what the private equity model is. And in a lot of cases, when a private equity firm takes a controlling interest in a company, they know exactly what they want to do, right? And what they want to do is get a return in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, the entrepreneur who's selling may be looking to maybe cash out, but in their mind, they're still thinking, I have a vision for this company. Absolutely. And the vision for the company may not align with the short-term returns that the private equity firm might want to see. And so I knew that in some cases, the PE firms I was working with had their own executives that they were going to bring into this deal. That eventually this founder and the leadership team were going to be exited, right? And I knew that, and I couldn't necessarily disclose that, but I knew that, and I could feel the pain and kind of empathize with what would happen within that company. And that was a bit tough because at the end of the day, I am an entrepreneur, right? And I get it, but I also understand what private equity firms were doing, right? And the value that they're trying to create so that they in turn can provide value to their investors, right? Their customers are investors, not necessarily the companies that they're investing in.
So then just to make this more precise, without mentioning the names, that's not relevant, but what stage, where along the deal stage was this firm positioned? So early phase, or what were they targeting?
They were targeting lower mid-market companies, and they were bringing me in on lower mid-market technology companies. So these were companies that had technology platforms, various industries, that were doing anywhere between, I would say, 20 million and 50 million in EBITDA. Okay. So that was anywhere between, I'd say, 50 million and 150 million in revenue, depending on those. So relatively mature.
As a side note, at the time, what year was it approximately?
That was around 2014 to 2018.
Okay, so do you remember what were the valuations,
yeah.
let's say, for multiples for companies doing like 20 million EBITDA at the time?
Well, at that point in time, we weren't looking at a lot at EBITDA. We were really ARR.
Okay, so it was really, you were counting on big growth still.
Yeah, and B2B, from what I recall, we were seeing 14 to 18 multiples in ARR. So
in
revenue,
ARR.
in revenue, yeah. We were really revenue growth at that point in time. Now, there was a COVID where cost efficiency became a real focus, and everybody started looking at profit. And I think that's now starting to shift back to growth, because I've seen most B2B SaaS valuations, again measuring on ARR, I would say around 6 to 8 for the most part, and in some cases I've seen 2. It's hard to tell exactly where the market goes, but when I was working at the private equity firm, they were paying pretty for growth companies on the AR side.
Understood. And then just for students that are, as we speak, they're having private equity classes. I want to explain for those that don't know, so the concept of an operating partner. So you said indeed the operating partner is not your finance guy who's doing let's say the modeling, the engineering. It's someone that the private equity firm has as part of their firm, but they bring them into the actual ventures to deal directly with the founders, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And there's 2 models for operating partner. There's the full-time operating partner. So you work full-time for the private equity firm.
That was you?
That was not me.
That was not you?
No,
okay.
I was working on a deal-to-deal basis with 2 different private equity firms. So they would bring me in on certain deals. Most of the time, it was a technology deal with some sort of B2B model, or even a consumer to a direct-to-consumer model. But it had some sort of subscription base to it. And they would bring me in because they did not have a lot of technology expertise. These were firms that were trying to move a portion of their investments into technology investments because they'd kind of missed the first run. They wanted to make sure that they didn't miss the second run of technology growth. And so they would bring me in to help them understand how to evaluate some of these companies. And that was everything from looking at how they were going to market, looking at their digital platforms, how they're in demand, but also looking at their employee base and understanding, are these the right people that we have to take us to the next scale of growth?
Excellent, excellent. So going back from private equity, I want to now jump a bit more thoroughly into Mouse Driver Chronicles. But let's do it like this. For those of you that want to know much more about the actual book, you can buy it on Amazon. For those of you that are students at LSB, we just bought 20 copies in the LSB library, so feel free to peruse. One thing that stood out from the book and from your story is, while you went on with your friend to build on the Mouse Driver business, and you will explain in a couple of moments what that business actually is and why it has that funny name, Mouse Driver. While you were doing that, am I clear to understand that some of your colleagues were, in their, basically were paper millionaires of the dot-com boom at the time, right? And how did that feel? How do you feel that you're doing this, you're in this mud trying to sell a consumer product while these guys are, obviously doing exceedingly well, and you went probably to the same school? And then how did it feel during that time? How did it feel later? Not to try ask, are you a petty person? No, but there must have been something where you were questioning yourself and being like, am I crazy? Why didn't I take the other route?
Oh man, every day of 1999 and in early 2000, we thought this. We really thought, what in the world have we done? Not only were many of our classmates paper millionaires, they'd gone to .coms and you just did this. Kyle had actually started another company while he was at Wharton. It was a company called paymybills.com, and he and 2 other classmates had started that. And Kyle had chosen to go do Mouse Driver. And I remember, driving on the 101, coming back from Palo Alto in probably early 2000, and seeing a huge billboard that said paymybills.com, right? And they had raised all this money and they were advertising, which is what all the .coms did. And every time we saw that billboard, we were just like, it just hit us like, oh, what are we doing? I've got all these computer mice stacked up to the ceiling in our apartment, right? We're not taking a salary. We thought that every day, and it was really because in 1999, early 2000, you could literally go to a launch party in San Francisco every day of the week. Dot-coms would raise their money, they would launch their product or service, and they would just throw these huge parties. It was crazy. And we'd go to these parties, and of course you meet all kinds of people, and you're telling everybody what you do, and everybody worked at dot-coms. I mean, everybody worked at dot-com. And they would ask us, what do you do? And we're like, well, we sell a computer mouse that looks like the head of a driver golf club. And they would look at us like, huh? So we started adding a bit more to that story, but we sell it online, right? And so, then we started saying, we're mousedriver.com. And as soon as you said we're mousedriver.com, everybody's like, oh, okay, I get
it's
it.
A website.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is perfect. What was Mousedriver? It's to a European mind, it's such a crazy story. Tell us what it was. How did you come about that?
Yeah, so Mousedriver is simply a computer mouse that's like the head of a driver golf club. So if anybody's interested in golf, when you tee off typically, maybe it's a Big Bertha, and maybe Mousedriver looked very similar to a Big Bertha.
So it's a golf club with that big, thick bottom, right? Yeah. So to speak. That's the first one that you use it to hit really far off.
That's exactly right. And so the idea was actually Kyle's. So I was at Anderson Consulting. He was on a project, I think in the middle of Mississippi somewhere, and he was really bored. And I remember, I think it was him and one of his colleagues, they came up with this idea for a computer mouse shaped as the head of a driver golf club. And I think they were in a bar somewhere, your typical, back of the paper napkin. And when we were in a market...
Did you ask them how much they had to drink?
Yeah, probably several beers, who knows, right? But when we had a marketing class together, and we were asked to, find a partner and come up with a marketing idea that you would present to the class. And Kyle and I were roommates, and so we became, partners for this class. And couldn't come up with anything. And so I think the night before we had to submit our idea, Kyle was like, well, I've got, I used this idea as, a subject of one of my essays for Wharton. Maybe we can just use this as our marketing idea. So then over the course of the next month, we put together a marketing plan for this thing. And we presented the marketing plan to an entrepreneurial marketing class that was taught by a professor named Len Lodish. And when we presented the idea in class, like everybody in the class were asking lots of questions and everybody seemed to be pretty excited about it. And Len pulled us aside and said, you guys should really think about doing this.
Really?
Yeah. And we're like, okay, whatever. And then Len's like, listen, if you guys go do this, I'll give you, $10,000 as a little bit of seed money to go bring this to market. Yeah. And his argument, which made sense at the time and now it makes even more sense, his argument was that if we were to go actually do this and try to make this work, at least for a year, he said we would learn 10 times more about business than we would if we went into investment banking or into management consulting, which, quite frankly, were these super attractive options coming out of Wharton at the time. And so he really made it, and Lynn had a very entrepreneurial background, incredibly successful, one of the favorite teachers at Wharton at the time. And to have someone like that, just one person kind of say, hey, listen, I think you'll learn a lot more if you do this. You could be very, very successful here too, and I'm gonna give you a little bit of money. Just to have that validation, that was enough for Kyle and I to say, you know what, maybe we should really think about doing this, right? And so that's kind of how the idea about, right?
How would you sum up our value proposition? Who was it for?
So we targeted Mousedriver in terms of positioning. It was essentially positioned as a high-end, unique golf gift item that was targeted towards women who were buying gifts for the men in their lives. So this could be their brothers, their husbands, their spouses, their partners, their dads, but anybody that could, that was playing golf that might want this thing. And we based that on research that we've done that said, 80% of the people that were playing golf at that time were men. We also knew that women controlled the pocketbooks when it came to buying gifts, whether it was for birthdays, whether it was for weddings, whether it was for holidays. Women, I think at that time, drove 90% of the gift purchases, so they controlled the wallets. And so we knew that most likely women were buying gifts for the men in their lives. And so we positioned this as a unique gift item, and we priced it in such a way that we felt like women would consider it a more premium gift item than a very cheap gift item.
Mm-hmm. and we discussed it in the class last week. You priced it, how do you go about pricing something like that? And then you were also testing, how did you conclude the right price at the end?
Yeah, so our initial way of pricing it was just to go into different gift stores and try to get a sense of, is there anything here that compares, right? Because again, we weren't comparing it to other computer mice, we were comparing it to gifts. And so we had to do that. Had to look at our own cost structure to make sure we weren't pricing this in such a way that we would lose money, because we didn't want to do that, but we also wanted to price it in such a way that we made money, because we had to pay ourselves. So we had to look at the margin requirements. But what we ultimately did, because pricing was really confusing to us, we didn't know how to price this, even though this is a very simple item, and this is something that I've learned over time, which is how critical pricing strategy is. But what we ended up doing is that we formed a relationship with this golf gift retailer somewhere in Marin County, which is just outside of San Francisco. And we asked her if we could bring in, a box of mouse drivers, and if we could just test the pricing. And she said, sure, no problem. And so we basically brought in a bunch of mouse drivers, and for 2 or 3 weeks, we priced it at $19.95, and we counted how many sold. And then we replaced it, and we raised it to $29.95, and we counted how many we sold. And we replaced it, and then we raised it to $39.95 US dollars. And we basically did that. I think we tested it over the course of 6 weeks, and we had a clear winner. I think we sold through like 75% of the units at $29.95. I think we sold 1 at $19.95, and we may have sold like 2 at $39.95. And that was our basis for our research, which was a very, I would say, early stage way of testing your pricing when you didn't really have any customers at the time. You didn't have a lot of information either.
So how, back in those days, how did you go about producing those mice? Were you ordering them in the US? Were you ordering from China? How did that work? Who was your supplier?
We'll go back to the network, right? So we manufactured in China, and his name is Kenny. And Kenny was kind of our point person with the manufacturing company in China. And we were introduced to Kenny, a Wharton classmate. This goes back to the connections in Wharton. One of our classmates worked for a big toy company in the US. And when we were sharing our idea with various classmates, he said, listen, if you ever need a manufacturer, I got a great person who can help you manufacture this thing. I used to work with him when I was at Hasbro, I believe was the company, or Mattel, one of the two. And I'm happy to make an introduction. So when we were ready to start trying to understand how do we manufacture this, we got an introduction to Kenny. And so we started working with Kenny, and I think Kenny thought this was very cute. I think Kenny was used to working with very large corporations, manufacturing, millions of units. Yeah. And I think he thought that this was just a cool idea. And I think he liked us, right? Because I think he thought, in his mind, he was like, what are these two guys doing, right? So he was incredibly helpful for us. And so we manufactured in China. And so we had to go back and forth during the prototyping stage. We had to go back and forth with Kenny, kind of give him an idea of what we wanted. He would give us options. What kind of material do you want to use? This is the expensive material. This is the cheap material. This is what you want to look like. What is the coloring? Here are the various to choose from. And so we had to go back and forth with him multiple times, iterating on various prototypes, getting feedback on prototypes, and eventually identifying what was the final prototype that we would go to market with.
Back in the days, I'm trying to also understand how it worked in terms of production, because usually for any startup in this case that wants to produce a hardware product, there is quite a lot of capital needs to be put up front, right? How did that work? Did you actually need a lot up front? How did you do the financing? I don't want to reveal it. You reveal it. It's pretty fun. How did you finance the venture in the early days? Also, what's the biggest amount of actual mouse drivers that you built, like that you had in your inventory?
Yeah.
So inventory is also something that needs to be carefully managed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, this may have changed because I think production lines have become much more pliable, and you can iterate on them, and they're more flexible. But back then, you definitely had minimum order quantities. In order to justify a product, a company basically changing all the machines to produce your product, which costs money and time, you had to have a minimum order quantity. But Kenny initially was willing to give us, I believe, 300 samples. And those are the samples that we used to kind of test before we made the decision to go order the minimum order quantity, right? And I can't recall, but I think we initially decided that we were going to, I think the minimum order quantity was 25,000. Okay. And I think it cost us bucks to manufacture. And so, and we ordered kind of late in the season, the holiday season. We wanted the units over here, and the way to do that, to get them over and be guaranteed, was to pay for the shipping, and in some cases fly them over. So obviously we didn't have $50,000, $100,000 to go invest in minimum order quantities. So we put all of that money on credit card debt. We essentially took cash out from our credit cards and paid for this with our credit cards. And it was a brilliant strategy because in the early 2000s, interest rates were low, relatively low, and credit card companies were really battling for customers. And you would get every 3 months, you'd get this letter saying, hey, we'll give you a free balance transfer and you'll get 0% for the next 6 months or the next 12 months on anything you transfer, if you switch up. So we must have switched between Kyle and I credit card companies 3 or 4 times. Yeah. At one point in time, I actually moved all of my business school debt to my cards because I could get it at 0%.
Great. Yeah.
Right? And so we played this credit card game. We talk about it in the book, where that was our funding mechanism. And we used that to fund our initial orders. Yeah. Now, we didn't expect to use 100,000. We went 50,000 in debt first, and that was to manufacture. But our initial run, and this is just a crazy story, sunk in the South China Sea.
Wait.
Yeah.
Your initial order of 25,000 units is at the bottom of the sea.
Yeah, I'll never forget it. There was, I believe it was Typhoon York.
Okay.
And we got a call from Kenny, and he said, yeah, your mouse drivers are no more. What do you mean? They're at the bottom of the ocean. What do you mean? Well, the container fell off the boat. I was like, that happens? So we had to do another run.
Did you have an insurance?
We had insurance. Okay. Insurance for us, it was about missing the holiday season.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So then we had to pay another $25,000, and then we had to ship them via FedEx to hit the holiday season. So we paid 10 times more in shipping.
That just goes back into that, into what we discussed. Like, you need to be able to take such news, right? That after all that work, 25,000 units are at the bottom of South China Sea, and you need to be able to decide, we move on fast. And
I mean, it's just crazy what you learn. So at that point in time, I would have thought that a container on a ship could fall off. Yeah. And that, obviously, having been in Spire Maritime it happens all the time. but then, first I'd ever heard of it, and it just happened to be our product. And it was just like one of those, are you kidding me? Lesson learned there is you always want to make sure you have contingencies, but in that particular case, make sure you order way sooner than we did for the holiday season.
Indeed. So as I'm asking you these questions about Mouse Driver, I actually have a plan in the back of my mind. At the time it didn't exist, but these days there's the very popular show, I'm sure you know of it, Shark Tank, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to envisage you standing in front of sharks and the questions that they're asking. So let's run it through to see whether Mark Cuban and the team would throw you out of the room or would invest. So you produced it for $2.
We produced it for $2.
Fantastic. I mean, that was actually already at the time to produce. Okay, great. Sold it at $29.99. Yeah. So potentially fantastic. You retailed it, right, in stores?
We retailed it.
As well as online?
We did sell online, but not that many.
Mainly retail.
Yeah, mainly
okay,
retail.
Great. Specialized retail or not?
Specialized retail. We sold in big box retail like Walmart, but we also sold in places called like Brookstone, the Sharper Image, a lot of these specialty gift stores in the U.S. And we also sold it as a promotional product where companies would put their logo on the mouse driver and give it out at corporate events.
Excellent. Yeah. So let's look at what were your highest point of sales. Like, what was your from the sales side, how many mouse drivers went out there into the market?
Well, I think eventually, we sold around 120, 140,000 mouse drivers. It was definitely north of 100,000 that we sold. So from that perspective, we generated, I believe it was like $2.5 million in total revenue.
And now I'm getting to Shark Tank aside. I'm getting to this. What is sometimes for people that are not in manufacturing business, what sometimes is very surprising, and I don't know how it's in your case, was you would think, okay, you generated, let's say, $2.5 million. So you would think, by doing simple math, that you were extremely profitable and that you managed to take a lot back home. So I don't know, that's my question. But there's this, I mean, when you read, for example, your story in so many ways connects to the book of Phil Knight's Shoe Dog.
Right.
One thing about that book is, other than grit, is it's so difficult for people that are not in such a business to conceive that in case of Shoe Dog, when he was selling hundreds of millions, he was always on the verge of bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Because you need to reinvest every single penny into producing
that's exactly
the next
right.
batch so that you can
that's exactly
How
right.
was it in your case?
Oh, the exact same thing.
Okay.
So one, there's a lot of other costs that go into that, right? We had packaging costs. Initially we had stored all of our product in our apartment, but then when we moved it into a warehouse facility, we had inventory cost, we had outsourced sales cost, we had marketing costs, getting the product into the country from China. There's always some costs there, right? Again, I didn't know everything that goes on with freight forwarding and things like that. So there's a lot of costs there, but if you're successful and there's demand, all that money that you're making has got to be reinvested back into making more product, right? And you're making more product, you're increasing your inventory runs, right? On top of that, you're getting feedback from your customers and you're trying to change the product. So we had to change the product from a PS2 to a USB mouse. Customers wanted a scroll wheel. So people were actually using the product, changed that. Our packaging that we first went out with was very rudimentary. I think we designed it. We ended up getting a professional to design packaging next. We hired somebody on the PR side. Right? So there's a lot of costs that go into that, but the biggest cost is reinvesting back into the company. Right? So we weren't just pulling all the margin out. It was going back into the company. I don't think Kyle and I actually paid ourselves for the first 18 months of this venture.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So, and that's really fantastic, because on a full line of questions regarding when you think about it, your success of the business creates a sort of effect where yes, it's great, but the commitment becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Were you able to find financing at that stage to produce the product, or you needed to really draw your cash out?
We could have found more financing for the product.
But not credit card financing.
Not credit card. We weren't going to do that again. We did that twice, going into card debt, and that's not something. The first time we were with it, because it was kind of cool. Entrepreneurs. We're in San Francisco. We could tell people we're $100,000 in credit card debt. The second time, you kind of know the realities of the situation. You're not as naive. So we wouldn't have done that. I mean, we could have gone to banks. We may have been able to raise a little bit of some more seed capital to an extent, but we would have had to shown that there was a bigger market for our product, or that we had other items that we were going to introduce building off the mouse driver success. And when Kyle and I kind of thought about it, it just wasn't something that we were that excited about doing. I mean, our vision initially was to sell as many mouse drivers as possible, get out, and then go do something else. Both Kyle and I came from a technology background, so we wanted to do something maybe more around .com at the time. So our vision wasn't to necessarily keep this thing going. Now, when we got a lot of publicity and mouse drivers started doing well, we certainly thought about it, and we kind of explored some different ideas. But at the end of the day, we weren't really excited about it. And I think if you're going to continue with a business or even start a new business, you truly have to be excited about it, because going back to those troughs and those highs, if you're not excited about what you're doing and you hit a low point, you're done.
And that's then to finalize that part of the discussion, I guess the sharks would tell you, very impressive kid, but you're a product, not a company. Would that be correct? The reason when you're starting a company, you often have a vision behind, right? With Mouse Driver, was there an overarching vision, or by listening to the story, it was more like, okay, you were encouraged by your professors to do it, it seemed like a thing to do, you started, it actually worked, but you kind of wanted to actually do maybe something else?
It was a product, not a company. Yeah. I don't think either one of us really thought in the sense of what is the vision of Platinum Concepts. Platinum Concepts was a company that brought Mouse Driver to market. That was our company. Our Mouse Driver, like, let's go bring this to market and sell as many as possible, make some money and then go do something else.
Excellent.
So it was not, in hindsight, we would have wrapped some sort of AI to it, we would have built some software, we would turn this into a massive consumer product company, and we certainly had some case studies of individuals that had done that, but what we necessarily wanted to do. So I don't think we would have survived the Shark Tank pitch.
Or probably that bald guy, what's his name, O'Leary, he would have squeezed you for a penny with like a debt proposal or something.
Exactly.
Okay, now I think I have a great segue into the more, if I may say, more part of what you did, even though, Mouse Driver is a fantastic story. And the segue is this. So many times I heard that sentence, and so many people often say it like, it's not a company, it's a product. It took me initially, years ago, it took me some time to understand what it really means, but I think it's so correct. And basically I see very often the students in my entrepreneurship class, students need to work on 9 weeks on a project, right? And so many of them come with ideas for products, which is natural because that's more relatable. Few of them come with the really idea for a company that would have a set of capabilities, and then let's see how we will use that capabilities and monetize. So what I'm trying to say is, in case of Mouse Driver, it's an interesting consumer product. Now, switching and doing a segue into space. Spire, for example, was a business where the vision was quite clear, from what I hear. It was quite clear what kind of capabilities the company could build. And then perhaps it was not entirely yet worked out or clear what are all the different ways you can actually capture value using those capabilities, right? And my understanding is that where you also came in the Spire story, because you're not the founder of Spire, but you helped them really turn a lot of the capabilities they had into operating businesses, into revenue, right? Monetize it. So switching from, product-centered thinking into more like, mission-based thinking, into like we have a company that wants to do a broad set of things. How does one think about, business versus like this sort of, we're building either an ecosystem player, or we'll be building with much broader set of capabilities?
Well, I think the key thing is, if you're building a company, you want to know that you're building for sustainable, long-term, profitable growth. So you have to believe that this company can be around for a long period of time, generating profits. And that really comes down to a couple. One, are you solving a real problem in the market, right? Is there somebody out there, a customer or a segment, that's going to actually be happy that you've got a solution for their problem, right? Are they willing to pay you for that? And are there a lot of those people in that segment that would be potentially paying for this, right? And that ends up being kind of your market opportunity, your market size. So those are kind of the initial things that you have to look at that help you determine whether or not this could be a company, right? At least in terms of the revenue aspect of it and being able to actually sell it. There's a whole other aspect of this too, which is kind of the cost aspect of it, meaning, what's it going to cost to actually be able to provide this product or this service, and to sell it, and to maintain it, and to keep people happy, right? And that's where you have to look at, okay, to bring this to market, what will it cost me? And can I price this in such a way that I can make margin on this, and margin to not only pay people, but to continue to reinvest in the company so that I can achieve the vision that I've set out for whatever the company is.
Excellent.
Right? And so I think with a product, it's really basically like, how much can I sell in what period of time, With a company, you've got to think long term. Is my basis for that.
So let's do this now. Help future potentially space entrepreneurs. Let's help them by just trying to think, how would today one get into the business of space? Okay, I don't want to now even discuss necessarily Spire as such. Spire is a publicly traded company. All the information about Spire is out there. Students can find out about it. So obviously I want to leverage your experience in Spire, but I don't want to talk just about Spire. But let's think about it today. Space is exciting. The one thing that always blows my mind is, I mean, it's been now what, over half a century that people actually went to the moon, right?
Yeah.
And it's crazy how the excitement about space obviously is a cyclical thing, right? We should have already been at the outer edges of the galaxy, not just with the Voyager, but we should have been doing much more, one could argue. But for many reasons we haven't, right? Because so far, even though we were there half a century ago, that was mainly because there was also this arms race between Soviets and Americans. But I think today we are at a different point in time. We are at a time where access to space is being democratized, right? We are at the time where, whether it's SpaceX, who really were the pioneers, but also now Blue Origin finally got their act together a little bit. I'm joking, but they also now managed to prove that they can reuse rockets, etc. They're achieving important milestones. So if you were now Wharton and young again, not that you're old, but if you were 20 years younger, would you today be excited about space? Would you decide in your early 20s to go into that business? How would you look at it today? How do you look at opportunities of creating a space-related business today?
Yeah, I'd probably be even more excited about now. So what's happened really in the last, I'd say, 15 years, the space has gone from primarily government funded to now being commercially viable, right? And you've seen all these early investments into kind of the key infrastructure parts of space. So you've got launch services, rockets going into the air. You've got satellite manufacturers like Spire and ISI and Planet Labs. You've got remote sensing payloads that are up in space. You now have data collection, and now you're starting to see the second layer of infrastructure. So edge computing, on orbit computing. You're starting to hear about space power and data centers in space. So you're seeing the infrastructure of space building in front of us. And when an infrastructure around an industry exists, that means that the downstream opportunities to take advantage of that infrastructure are immense. And so if I were coming into this industry, there's two ways of looking at this. One, I might choose to go more into the infrastructure side, which is how can I continue to support the massive growth that we're going to see as it relates to space, right? And that might be one way. And that is probably more of a deep tech focus, which takes a little bit longer, but also might provide a bit more of a competitive moat once you're in market. The other way, and probably the faster way to take advantage of space, is to be more downstream and focus on the data that's coming from space and what can you do with that data to solve problems on Earth, right? And that's where the data and the data analytics companies are coming into play. That's a bit of a faster life cycle in terms of coming to market and ultimately getting to the point where you're generating revenue and ideally profit. But there's a tremendous amount of opportunity because of what's happening in space.
And indeed, you mentioned the downstream, so you, for example, work on data from space. Technically speaking, that you might as well start tomorrow, right? Everything exists. I mean, providers, so the infrastructure is already in space operating, data is being gathered, right? Someone could theoretically go to Spire and make a deal with them to get access for their data, which they're going to interpret in some way, right?
No, that's absolutely correct.
So there are immediate opportunities. People usually talk about doing business in space. Everybody probably has initially some physical idea of something that I've built is up there, but that doesn't, you don't have to think about it like, right?
No.
Just like, you know, you can be a transportation company, manage trucks, but not be a truck driver.
That's right.
You don't have to be doing the actual
That's
driving,
right. That's right. And the basics of it are now there. And now you're seeing, you know, more competition around that infrastructure, more companies trying to build out that infrastructure, the second generation of the infrastructure being built out, and that's just going to open up all of these downstream opportunities.
And tell me this, so my understanding is anything created on Earth for space is done in a very special environment, right? You assemble it in your house like screwdrivers, right? It needs to be done in a very specific way. Thereby, I would assume that anything built for space needs to be done in a way, sort of, to simplify, in a certified way being done for space, right? So could you say that actually there is a range of services, products and skills that exist on Earth that could be sort of recertified to be used in space? So space could be almost like an opportunity to reinvent the wheel a little bit, as an example. I'm just brainstorming now, but as an example, if I'm a welder and I have you know, some experience welding because I've done it with cars or whatever, with ships, there might be welding needed, for example, on products designed for space, but then it's done in a properly specific way. Am I correct so far?
That's correct. I mean, you obviously have to think about the different elements and the versatility of space as you're building, particularly if you're building hard assets.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple things here, right? One is now, yes, you're building it on Earth. I think over time, a lot of those assets that we're talking about will be built in space, and most likely they're going to be built by robots, right? And I think that's where you're going to start to see that shift, because I think it will be, well, I shouldn't say always, but I think it will be expensive to get people into space. I think we're still a long ways out from having people, you know, living on the moon and being able to, utilize those skill sets for welding, you know, on the moon. Right?
No, of course.
But I did like now. Yes, I think they can be transferable. You have to understand kind of how does what I do now need to, in order to adjust to kind of the space economy and the space industrialization.
Indeed, to be clear, I wasn't suggesting they're going to weld on the moon. I was thinking more in specialized production facilities on Earth, which there's probably still few comparing to how many there will need to be. One that has a specific skill set that was used in the car industry might adjust it and certify it to be used in such a facility, for example. Right?
Absolutely.
Now, one thing that obviously, when we talk about space, today the Andrew Carnegie of space is, you could argue, Elon Musk, right? And one thing that I find exciting, without now going too much into the whole Muskology, but really the Starship, right? I mean, that for someone who doesn't know much about space like me, sounds very exciting. I heard an analysis of why Starship potentially could really be a complete game changer, and it's not just that it can be reusable, of course. It's not just also its volume and its power, but basically you get extra sort of extra capacity, they say, on every one of those variables. So first, it's much bigger than anything else. Hence, when it's becoming reusable, it will have a larger reusable volume. Second, you will be able to fit much more into it. And then due to all of that, the cost will go radically down. So basically, apparently, the order of magnitude is multiple comparing to existing rockets, right? Which then likely might mean that already it will become more feasible to just start producing Earth, sending it into space before we get to the robots producing things into space. So my question to you is, would you today, take a private equity hat, or VC hat rather, you're now a venture capital investor, would you bank on Starship being in 5 to 6 years what they're claiming it will be, so up and running? Would you bank on that to the point that you would today start building a business that is counting on using Starship in 5 to 6 years?
There's a lot of different ways to unpack that question. One, I mean, Elon's brilliant, and there's no doubt about that. Starship is a game changer. Elon's also known for promising things that don't necessarily happen in the time frame that he's saying.
Hence my question.
Right? I mean, I think autonomous driving, I think he initially said that was going to be by like 2017. And I think Tesla is just now getting to the point where you know, they've got it, you know, kind of figured out, and the robo-taxis are going out there. You know, from that perspective, I think there's still some time there. But I'm not sure, and this is my personal preference, like as an entrepreneur, you know, you have a lot of ambiguity, a tremendous amount of ambiguity as an entrepreneur, right? You just don't have all the information, and your ability to assess different situations with no information is absolutely critical. You know, part of that ambiguity is making sure that you have as much control over your decision making and over the ultimate outcome of your company as possible. I would have a hard time, you know, building a company now for something that I don't know if it's for sure going to be here in 1 year or 5 years, right? Because again, that's out of my control. And so I'd probably try to optimize on things that are more in my control.
Excellent, excellent. So we will switch to a slightly different format. I will ask sort of pointed questions, and then we just answer them.
Perfect.
We will be able to clip them later.
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, okay. But still related to space. So let's start like this. So John, tell us this. Let me restart. So John, tell us this. Your wife asked you to, you know, have sorry, wait. No, I need to make it shorter.
Okay, then I think it could be nice if you look to the camera.
Okay.
For this one.
Perfect.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so let me then do it like this. Basically, what I want to ask you is, you now have a mandate to start a rocket company, right? Go.
Okay.
How would you do it? So, okay, let me do it. So, John, tell us, how would you start a new rocket company in Europe?
A new rocket company in Europe. Well, first I'd want to understand what's the problem this is going to solve that's not currently being solved. That would be my first question. Is this rocket company a real problem? You're going to be able to launch, for instance, satellites into a completely different orbit that most other rocket companies aren't going after. So that's going to be my first question. The second question I'm going to ask is really, well, who are the people who are going to buy my rockets? You know, what are the companies or the segments that are out there that could really utilize these types of services? Do they exist? So, for instance, if I'm building a rocket company that's launching to orbit, you know, are there companies out there that really want to have constellations of satellites in equatorial orbit? And if so, how many of them are there? You know, what's the problem they're trying to solve? You know, who are the decision makers in those companies? I'd want to know specifically, you know, what's the problem that they have. And so I would use things to kind of determine, okay, there might be an opportunity to go build this rocket company. I did do some back of the envelope math to try to figure out what the total addressable market is and the service addressable market is, which always in early stage is kind of, you know, this. You never quite know exactly what it is. As an investor, I don't put a tremendous amount of focus on you know, market sizing because it's so subjective to individuals. I just want to know that there's a clear problem and that there does seem to be a market that's big enough. So I'd want to know that the market is big enough for me to go invest all of my time and potentially money into building a rocket company. I'd then start to focus on, okay, what do I need to do to essentially make money here? How much margin do I need to make? What are the costs that are going to be involved in building this? How am I going to manufacture the rockets? Where am I going to find the vendors to work on these rockets? What are the materials, the tools that I'm going to need to make these rockets? What are the regulatory approvals that I might need to have in order to launch a rocket in the US, in China, in Russia, in India, in Europe? Like, how difficult is that? What are the partnerships I might need to forge in order to make this, the ability to launch these rockets easier? So those are the things that I would probably look at initially to determine, okay, you know, what's the level of effort and the potential success rate of me starting this company. So those are all the things that I would look at. I would also try to figure, okay, is my objective here just to launch a company, or do I have a bigger vision here? You know, is it do you launch this rocket company to potentially start to invest in mining Mars for something? Is it because I believe that there should be a massive ecosystem around rocket launches, and I think I can start to potentially vertically integrate and bring tremendous value to downstream customers? So I look at the ultimate vision and try to figure out, okay, where do I eventually want to go with this? Because that ultimate vision is going to be what I lock myself into and what I really try to communicate to my employees. So those would be kind of the first things that I start to look at. Secondarily, more like, how do I go to market? In my experience, the easiest thing is the technology side. The easiest thing is actually taking your idea and being able to bring it to market. That might take years for launching new rockets, but eventually you kind of know what you're trying to do. The go-to-market side, which is the ability to actually sell your product and to make money on your product, even though that sounds relatively easy, to me is the most challenging aspect of building any new business. And go-to-market is absolutely critical, and I think that's what ultimately makes or breaks companies. So I'd start to think through, what does the go-to-market strategy potentially look like? How am I going to get the word out? How am I going to build awareness? How am I going to sell? How am I going to position this with those customer segments and those decision makers that I've identified earlier? Am I going to go through various distribution channels? Am I going to focus on governments versus commercial first? Those are all the different types of things that, as you're thinking through your idea, you don't have to have it completely crystallized, but you need to have a general idea of how easy or hard is this going to be to take to market. And to be frank, going to market is always difficult. So it's always going to be a challenge.
Excellent. Now, provocative question, John. You are appointed tomorrow as, let's say, the head of the European Commission or whatever executive body of the European Union. You're looking at the race to space between the US and China. What do you do? How do you bring Europe into that game? You have full executive powers. You, just like the American president, you can issue 700 executive orders and do whatever you want.
I mean, if I'm going to put my European hat on, Europe has got to develop a level of sovereignty they just haven't had over the last 50 years. So Europe has got to start making the investments. They have to start driving more innovation. They have to start driving the scale experience. They need to start investing in the defense sector. If I'm Europe, I think the easy way out is to say, you know what, U.S. and China, they're already so much further ahead. Let's just partner with them. Let's utilize their technology. That's going to be the easiest and the fastest way for us to utilize space. But I think Europe has got to start making these investments. I think they've got to start bridging the gap between the government funding and the EU agencies and entrepreneurs and investors. And I think that they massively have to start investing in identifying scale, expertise, and experience, because I do think that there is a level of sovereignty that Europe needs to have moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Now take your investor hat on, John. What is the primary difference that you see between American appetite for risk-taking and European?
The primary difference, I think, is just it's a cultural difference. And the way I like to explain it is and this is I'm generalizing here. I'm very much generalizing. If you put a wall in front of most Europeans and you say that this wall is absolutely non-penetrable and there's no way you can get around it, through it, or above it, but your life depends on it, but you just can't do it, Europeans will look at the wall. They may actually go through the effort of figuring out exactly how it can be done, but realize that it takes a tremendous amount of effort. And you know what? Things are pretty good right now. Life is good. It is what it is. An American would look at that wall, get the same information, and they would say, one way or the other, we're going to figure out how to blow through this wall, and they would figure out a way of getting through that wall. And again, it's a generalization, but the mentality that I've seen for the most part is that there's an American mentality that basically is, you know what? We will figure it out. There's an optimism that you just figure it out, and in some cases, you might have to do things that aren't comfortable. You might have to work harder, or you might have to put yourself at risk to do it. But that's just the American mentality, and I think the European mentality is much more risk averse, either driven by just fear of what could happen, which I think if you go back to the history of Europe is understandable. But I think it's just that mentality, that get it done mentality, and that like nothing is impossible, and the word impossible just doesn't exist with the American mentality. And I think that, to me, is the biggest difference. And again, very much generalizing here. I've met incredible European entrepreneurs, so I just want to...
Absolutely, and not just generalizing, but I mean the purpose of this is to tease a little bit.
Yeah.
So now let me then, now we'll do it like this. I will say like a statement, and then I want you to comment and counter on it. But it's connected to what we just discussed. So when you really think about Europe, very often we need to look for understanding Europe and the context of Europe, we need to look into Europe's history. Now, this idea that mentality is different is, I think, today a fact, but historically couldn't be less true, because historically the guys that discovered Americas, historically, whether it's the Portuguese that went all the way to Japan, whether it's Magellan that circumvented the globe, those people were 100 times crazier than any of the entrepreneurs we're talking about today, because we know way more about space and about the immediate surroundings of planet Earth than we knew about where they were heading back then.
That's right.
Where I think you, as an investor, I think the answer is somewhere else. That Europe really now is living in a short blip of its history, which post World War II security that we have created for ourselves, where we are just comfortable, which historically never existed in entire European history. And when you think about it, how would you comment on the fact that the venture model that existed back in the days was the following: the Queen of Spain or the King of Spain or Portugal or whatever power would basically set aside a large initial venture investment and then promise riches in case of success. So true venture capital, right? And basically they would then give explorers who were competing for that initial investment, for the initial seed, they would, the explorers would come, pitch the king or queen, say, I will take an expedition, I will take 3 boats, 200 men, and I will, I will go west and I will return from the east. That model seemed to have worked because great things were done from a purely exploring to view. Is there a way for Europeans to sort of reclaim a little bit that mentality? Is there a way maybe for different models of financing? Because what we see today also, the venture capital model we know today is the American capital model, which is exported pretty much in Europe and all over the world. Is there maybe a need for a different model? Have you, with your investor hat, have you ever seen that the American maybe venture capital model perhaps doesn't work in Europe, or should it be done differently? Or is it really just a mentality issue that we discussed?
I mean, I think models, there's been of the venture capital model that certainly can work in Europe. You see now, a lot of venture capitalists moving into the incubator space, where they can incubate companies and take a larger equity percentage of these companies early on, and also get involved from a more operational perspective. And I think that's kind of another iteration of the VC model, certainly on the early stage. I don't necessarily think that the VC model as it sits today is necessarily the wrong model. I just think that there needs to be more of it. I think there needs to be more investors. I think there needs to be, certainly in Europe, more seed level investors, ones that are willing to take risks, not necessarily investing in seed level technology companies expecting that they're going to get their real estate returns of 6 to 8%. That's just not the mentality. From my perspective, and again, you could argue, the government involvement and how does government and commercial work in the European Union. I actually think and like how the European Union provides plenty of government money, it seems. I think they might do that with too many constraints because everyone is looking out for their own countries. And I think, again, if you really want to drive innovation, you want to look at this holistically as a union, not necessarily as countries. But for me, it really is the mentality. And to your point, Maren, I mean, a lot of this is driven not just from World War II, but if you go back in history, Europe has had all kinds of different wars. and you've had this, 50 years of relative peace. And I think, for the most part, people might be like, you know what? Let's not upset the apple cart, right? Let's not get too crazy. And if you look at Americans outside of the American Revolution, they've had 250 years of no one, invading them for the most part. I think that does impact that cultural mentality, but that's also the mentality I think needs to see a little bit of a shift on the European side.
Indeed. Final question, John. When do you plan to retire?
No, I don't plan on retiring.
I know, that's why I'm asking.
No, I don't plan on retiring. I like involved. I like building things. I don't see myself retiring. Now that doesn't mean that I necessarily see myself building businesses and running businesses for the rest of my life. But I don't see myself retiring and playing
feeding pigeons.
Yeah, feeding pigeons, dominoes at the cafe every afternoon. That's not going to be me. So I'm always going to in something for sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was really great.
Yeah, fantastic.
If there's for all of you out there, order Mouse.
Thank you very much.
Driver Chronicles.
Thank you.
For the students, you can pick it.